Thanks for tuning in for another episode of our weekly broadcast. This week's topic, what is the state of the socialist movement? And to dive into this question, we're going to go back a couple years to an exchange we had with Jacobin magazine in 2018. And it's true that in many ways, we're living in a world that's very different from even just 2018. I mean, the political landscape is rapidly evolving in the US. And even since the beginning of the year, we see changes taking place. If you consider just the events of the last couple of months under the impact of this pandemic, we're now facing another Great Depression-like scenario in many parts of the country. 36 million people have already lost their jobs in the last couple of months. People are going hungry. 35% of households are now experiencing food insecurity, households with children. So you have all this accumulated discontent. You have unprecedented anger at the status quo, at the inequality of this class society that is now more evident than ever. And you have a desire to fight against it, to fight against the billionaire class, to fight against capitalism. And yet the focal point of that mood up until now, the Bernie Sanders campaign, is once again closed up. And so as a result, you have a political crisis, a two-party system that has been undermined, that is now being questioned and rejected more than ever before. Among millennials, over 70% reject both major parties. And so it's no surprise that the largest voter bloc is non-voters. People were fed up with the Democratic Party after 2016. And now, given the way that the 2020 primaries have played out, in many ways it's been a repeat of the 2016 episode. But this time people are fed up with the lesser evil argument. They've had enough. And you can really feel that we're approaching a boiling point with this process. It's going to erupt sooner or later. This pressure will find an outlet. And aside from the political crisis, we also see what direction the class struggle is going. Back in 2018, when this debate was held, we were starting to see some labor ferment. We saw the beginning of some strike action a couple of years ago that was signaling that something was starting to change in the labor movement. But since then, we're now watching the beginning of a strike wave unfolding across the country in every corner of the US. We've seen over 200 wildcat strikes since March. All of these events are having a clarifying effect for a lot of people who are moving in the direction of socialism, who are open to revolutionary ideas. And so it's actually in this context that we wanted to return to the debate with Jacobin magazine. this exchange between Bhaskar Sankara and John Peterson, because some of the topics they discussed ended up anticipating the certain aspects of the world we now live in. And of course, the most important part of this exchange of views of different programs is to establish clarity, political clarity about where the socialist movement is today and where it's headed. As earth-shattering and as historic as these events have been that we've lived through in the last couple months, we are barely at the beginning of this process. The major events are yet to come, and we're confident that this is a revolutionary period of world history. These events are shaping the outlook of a living generation that will be faced with the task of transforming society. So we need clear ideas. And without further ado, we hope you enjoy the second installment of this debate. What is the state of the socialist movement?
I'm going to move on to the next question now, and we're going to, after we've talked a bit about what socialism is, and take a step towards where we are right now. And the question I'm going to pose, and we'll start with you, John, on this one, is what is the state of the American socialist movement right now?
The state of the socialist movement now, I mean, I'm more excited than I've ever been in my whole life. I'm sure you agree with where things are now. I mean, the enormous potential that there is for people to really come to grips with what socialism is and what it isn't. There's more self-identified socialists than ever. Poll after poll show that millions of people, I mean, by some estimates, a third roughly of the whole population is in favor of this, especially people that are, 18 or older, or who are the ones that they're polling. They show that, tens of millions of people are in favor of this. And if you look at the younger people, so-called Generation Z, they're even more to the left. But I think what's really interesting is you actually see a lot of elderly folks, retirees, who lived through the Cold War, and even they are open to socialism as an option on this planet, which I think says a lot. But at the same time, I think there's an enormous atomization on the left, enormous lack of clarity, above all politically. I mean, I think that the left sometimes gets a bad rap, and justifiably so, for what appear to be from the outside little turf wars, different sectarian little grouplets all fighting against each other, yelling against each other. But when I talk about, what I think is important is political clarity around what we're fighting for. It's not, what particular organizational form or anything like that, but what ideas, what program, what perspective for the socialist transformation of society in our lifetimes are we talking about? So I think that lack of political clarity is one of the key things that we've got to deal with. I would also add that it's not only the state of the socialist movement, but the state of the labor movement today. The labor movement, obviously the working class is the class that has a revolutionary potential to transform society and bring about socialism. And the labor leaders are playing a lamentable role these days. The labor leadership of the main trade unions, the AFL-CIO, and all the big unions, they basically accept capitalism. They accept the bounds of capitalism, and they do everything in their power, frankly, to stop the working class from actually moving in the struggle. The strikes of all the teachers earlier this year that were so inspiring had to take the form more often than not of wildcat strikes because the labor leadership wouldn't give them the go ahead. When you had just recently the possibility for a strike at UPS among the Teamsters workers. Through outright fraud, the Hoffa Junior leadership basically cut across this unleashing of the working class's ability to just shut down production. And that's where the power of the working class lies. It's the ability to shut down production and to freeze production in its tracks, to stop the profits from flowing, to stop goods and services from moving around, and show who really actually has their hands on the running of society, which is a very dangerous question if you start realizing, as I'm sure you'd agree, that you don't need capitalists in order to run society. I think, though, that the key problem with the left today, the key problem that the socialist movement is facing, is the question of political independence, and the fact that most socialists, at least I could say at least a lot of the newer socialists these days, there's a lot of people that think that we should go through the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, as I'm sure everybody knows, is a party of slaveholders originally. It's the party of the northern capitalist class. It's not a working class party. It's never been worker friendly. You see over time that the Republicans and the Democrats have sort of switched good cop, bad cop roles and appealed to different layers of the population in order to maintain and bounce off each other, ultimately to continue the domination of the capitalists in this country. But subordinating the interests of the working class, subordinating the interests of socialists to a capitalist party. And, you know, it's not just me saying they're a capitalist party. Nancy Pelosi was asked a few months ago, you know, what do you think about moving the Democrats in a socialist direction? She says, you know, we're capitalists. That's just how it is. I mean, if you look at what happened in the recent elections, a number of candidates who identified as socialists have been elected, and yet they've already backtracked on a whole number of progressive things that they said they might be interested in fighting for if they're elected. So I think the question of breaking with the Democrats is really key, and it's a dividing line. The question of class independence. The working class is the majority, so why shouldn't we have a party of our own? I would say that the working class needs not a third party, but a first party. We're the majority. If this is going to be a democracy, then the working class should have its own party. And that party, I think, with a program that would address the needs of working people, of housing, of jobs, of education, of unemployment, et cetera, would very quickly be able to come to power even, just like the last time we had the rise of a revolutionary party in this country. Believe it or not, it was the Republicans. And they were able to go from formation to sitting in the White House within about 6 years.
Yeah. So I would say that my faith in the state of the movement is partially my faith in what ordinary working class Americans are thinking and doing, and it's actually been steps in the right direction in recent years. You're seeing more people than ever supporting Medicare for all. You're seeing progressive moves in the direction of opposition to mass incarceration. You're seeing support for things like jobs guarantees, and no surprise, this support is correlated with unemployment in the places that actually need these things the most. So a majority of people in Mississippi, for example, support a jobs guarantee. Then, of course, there's cause for optimism among our segments of the left. I mean that broadly, because we were a left of a few thousand people, and now we're a left around 60,000-70,000 people. Socialist left. And that's obviously progress. And I don't mean that, I mean, we have a larger self-described, socialist left that we have had in many decades. DSA has 50,000 members. I mean, these are things that we shouldn't take for granted, because those of us who remember, I joined DSA around 11 years ago. And my first meeting in New York City, there was 5 people there, like 5 people, and it was like a good turnout. And people were very excited that someone under the age of 40 showed up to the meeting. I would keep coming to those meetings, mostly because I would get free food afterwards. But, I would say that the real tension we have is we have these big, kind of complex, not fully formed tendencies of people, and we have the Sanders push. And whatever you think of Bernie Sanders, I'm a supporter of Bernie Sanders, but we have 13 million Americans voting for a self-described, democratic socialist. That means something. It means something that Bernie Sanders can go into even counties that voted for Trump and have people that will go to his town halls and listen to him. And a lot of these counties, as they're getting fed up, they're rejecting Trump. So we could say that we don't like a lot of the Democrats they're voting for, but we should also think that they were given really 2 options on the ballot, and they resoundingly, the Democrats won the popular vote and swung a lot of these districts more in the direction, because people are resoundingly rejecting what Trump's offering, and they're seeing through his deceptions. The things he was promising is not the things he's been delivering. But then I think that we should separate these 2 things out. We could say that there's a small ideological socialist movement. Then there's this broader movement, this broader current, and they both have issues. But what we want to see is we want to see a merging of the 2 together. We want to imagine a time when we can think of a workers' movement, we can think of a socialist movement. We're not thinking about 2 separate things. We're thinking about social movements. We're just imagining one coherent mass in which there are certain divisions of labor, there's certain things going on, but right now it's the lack of embeddedness in the American movement is really striking, even compared to Europe and other advanced capitalist countries, where the momentum seems to be not in their favor, where they're backtracking. You'll still do a talk, and there'll be people who are just workers there, and it's not, oh, there's these 5 people here, and there are workers. They're the people that we managed to, through industrialization or through something else, recruit. No, these are just the people who tend to support socialist politics, who happen to be at socialist meetings. And I think we have a long way to go before we get to that. And I think that should be the real question of embeddedness. And the final thing I'll say on this is just the question of political independence. There used to be a slogan that was said a lot in the Trotskyist movement in particular, but throughout the far left in the 50s and 60s, and it went something like, down with the elephant, down with the ass, let's build a party of the working class, which is nice because it rhymed, and things that rhymed are better. I think we lost that rhetorical flair at some point, So first of all, I agree with the vision of political class independence. And this is something that the left has always strived for. All portions of the left, the great struggles of the 19th century, the struggles of even the construction of the Second International and whatnot, were about creating political independence and creating political independence from liberalism in particular. Both the Lassalleans and the Marxists were fighting for this. The question is, just having a slogan, just having the rhetoric isn't enough. We have to have a much more difficult question of, why hasn't this worked? This has been our rhyme for literally 100 years. It's not because we haven't said it enough. Saying something over and over again doesn't actually do anything. It hasn't worked because of a variety of factors. One was the extreme violence of the U.S. state, suppressing the workers' movement in the 1890s, using the force of the U.S. State to scatter the Socialist Party in the 1910s, scatter the IWW, scatter all these movements. There's a variety of other more boring political science, answers. One is that U.S. workers who had many of them had already had suffrage and already were voting for 2 major parties, and the ballot system was designed to prevent the emergence of third parties. And some of them were just contingent. There were certain moments where we had the opportunity to build an independent party in the 1890s, the 1920s, some degree in the 1930s and 40s, but those avenues weren't pursued, partially as a result of the trade union bureaucracy, partially as a result of mistakes by leaders, partially as the result of just trying those things, but failing. But the failures weren't just a string of failures. They were cumulative. One failure made it harder to do it the next time, and the next time, until we end up in our fairly miserable present, where the majority of Americans don't have a party that represents their majority interests. But I think there's a difference between the response to that among some members of the socialist left. The majority response in the American movement has historically been, therefore, we have to deal with what we have. We have to go into the Democratic Party, and we have to realign the Democratic Party and make it function something like these European labor and social democratic parties have. That was the old strategy. I think there's still portions of DSA and portions of the left that is pursuing that party in certain ways. This is the kind of strategy of the Justice Democrats, with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others are associated with. What we're proposing, people around Jacobin and others, is something different, which is just simply, we are using the Democratic ballot line, and we are running as open socialists with our own programs, our own basis of funding, and we're using that bully pulpit to run competitive races that sometimes win and sometimes don't. And we're making socialism relevant to millions of people who never heard of socialism before as a result. Now, is that political class independence, or is it not? If I run tomorrow on a Republican ballot line in a city, in a partisan race, and I run as an open socialist, I run with my own source of funding, with my own 10-point program, am I now a tool of the Republican Party? It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem logical to me. I'm not saying these parties are empty vessels to be transformed. I'm saying that we could use propagandistically the ballot lines, and it's actually been working. So this was a theoretical discussion. I used to have this debate with ISOers 3-4 years ago, and I thought both positions were reasonable, and it was a reasonable debate then, I believe this debate has been resolved, and that tactically it's been useful, and tactically it's still been an independent left strategy to connect our disparate, really small working socialist movement with a wider workers' movement.
John, do you think that it's been resolved?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think that's still the key question that needs to be sorted out. I mean, it is true that DSA growing to 50,000 members, I think that's fantastic development. It shows not only are people calling themselves socialists, but they actually actively want to get involved in something. But it is true that it is a very broad, amorphous. When you talk about 95 million people in a poll that sort of say, yeah, I'd be open to socialism, that doesn't mean they've read, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, whatever. Doesn't mean they necessarily have to, as long as they're fighting around a clear program that I would argue has to transcend the bounds of capitalism. But it is a huge step forward. But I was, Bernie Sanders, there's no question about it. He blew things wide open and put socialism on the map in a way that I would argue had never happened in this country before. I mean, the last time socialism was that popular was back when Eugene Debs was thrown in jail. I mean, literally 100 plus years ago. But I was a little bit surprised. I mean, I'm surprised that people that consider themselves socialists still say they support Bernie Sanders after, what ended up happening at the DNC in the city. A lot of people that were here in Philly at that time must have felt what that was like. And this capitulation to Clinton to say, well, this is just the world we live in. What are you going to do? Vote for Hillary? Even if you looked a little bit disgusted as you said it, a lot of people, I think, realized that that was a dead end. And a lot of people, I think, will never be going back to the Democratic Party after that. So I think that it's absolutely true. A lot of Republicans can be won to socialist ideas on a class basis. During the 2016 elections, Trump, when he would talk about Hillary, you know what kind of crowds, what kind of comments people would say. But whenever he talked about Sanders, he was very careful not to go after him because there was kind of a reverent silence around Sanders because he was talking about things that they need in the Rust Belt: jobs, healthcare, education. So I think that's interesting that on a class basis, both of those parties can be blown apart. It's not going to be just the Democrats, but the Republicans. I like this imagery of W.B. Du Bois, who talking about in a book about John Brown, he talked about how all the different streams of dissatisfaction were streaming inexorably towards what ended up becoming the conflagration of the Civil War. And I think what we're seeing now with this thaw of decades of sort of anti-socialist ideas is the beginnings of those streams, different currents of struggle starting to come together towards what will eventually be a raging river that I think will have the power to smash right through all the dams that capitalism puts up to try to keep it back. And I think that we have to, if we look at history, the consciousness of the working class leaps ahead, very dramatically at certain stages. We can't judge the future by the past, and we can't judge the way people think, 5 years from now from the way people think today. And I think that's important. And so the question of political independence, I don't see how one can be in favor of it while at the same time saying that we could, run as a Democrat or a Republican, and it doesn't matter. In a country like the United States, where people look at things in a pretty black and white way, I think that if you say vote Democrat because I'm running as a Democrat, and I would never run as a Democrat, but if you say that, you're then responsible for whatever the Democrats do. I mean, maybe not. Look, you mentioned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I mean, look what's happened already since the nomination or winning the primary to where we are today. And I think a lot of people didn't want to hear it when it was said that, look, I mean, if you work in that party, you're going to be bound by its rules, and that's basically what's happening. So I think that's important. As far as the violence of the capitalist state stopping the working class from forming its own political party, I mean, all capitalist states, all states are violent. I mean, if you look at Tsarist Russia, they weren't able to stop the Russian Revolution from happening. Even in countries like Iran, for example, the Shah's state apparatus wasn't able to stop itself from being overturned at a certain point. And pretty much every country in the so-called advanced capitalist world has a workers' party, or at least at one point did, a mass socialist party, communist party, labor party, etc. Some political vehicle for expressing themselves. They weren't stopped. So I don't think it'd be fair to say that there's a unique American exceptionalism that has prevented that. I would argue And you kind of alluded to this, that it's by mistakes of the leadership, the mistake of the leadership, or the lack of a leadership that understands the need to do that. The fact that several times when there were opportunities to move in that direction, for example, in the 1930s with the rise of the CIO, which was an elemental class struggle taking place in the big new industries that were erupting in all parts of the country, really, you had a new kind of trade unionism, a new workers' movement emerge, and there was the possibility to give that a workers' expression. You have states like Minnesota that did have a farmer labor party that actually had a pretty advanced program and actually pretty advanced conditions for the working class in Minnesota in the 1930s compared to what we have to deal with in the rest of the country today. So I don't think that that's an insuperable obstacle. As far as the structures of the capitalist setup being completely rigged and being undemocratic and really set up for a two-party system, even though there's nothing about that in the Constitution. Again, I think that if there's enough of an elemental upsurge and a will and a way forward pointed by the labor leadership, by the left leadership, then people will start to see that direction. But when you have the labor leadership saying, "Oh no, don't move in that direction," or you have the leaders of the socialist movement saying, "Oh no, don't go in that direction. Let's run maybe as a Republican. Let's run maybe as a Democrat." You're not offering a vision and perspective. And I think if people want to know where to go, they have to be able to see where that might be. And so that's what I would say.
All right, that's it for tonight's segment. We hope you enjoyed it. And we hope it also helped shed some light on the period and the process that we're living in today. The debate on class independence is far from over. In fact, for millions of people, it's a debate that is just beginning. The working class desperately needs a party of its own that can act as a vehicle for its interests, the interests of the vast majority of society. And this is the time for socialists to be fighting for class independence. We would argue that if such a party is going to succeed in gaining a mass base, it has to be rooted in the labor movement. It has to present itself as a distinctly working class party, and it has to be a fighting organization in the class struggle. A mass party of the working class could help the labor movement to roar back to life in the coming years, if it actively links up with the rising strike movement and puts forward a systematic appeal for organized labor to break with the Democrats and instead channel its resources into fighting for working class interests. And there's a name for that kind of program. A program that fights against the billionaires, against the capitalist system, fights to bring the working class to power and dramatically improve the living standards for billions of people around the world. It's called a revolutionary socialist program, and it's not a scary word. Millions are in favor of socialism. And millions are in favor of revolution, particularly in the generation that makes up the largest segment of the working class today. The recent period of relative stability is gone forever. The socialist movement is only going to grow. And what we're doing at Socialist Revolution and in the International Marxist Tendency around the world is preparing the cadre, a professional and well-organized network of trained revolutionary activists with roots in the working class and the presence across the country, in every major city, every industry, a network that can systematically bring a socialist program into the workers' movement. When the working class establishes a mass party of its own, and we are closer to seeing this kind of development than ever before, we will be a part of that fight, putting forward a program that can bring the working class to power, establish a workers' government, and transform society. Until the working class has its own party, things are not going to improve for the vast majority. The task has never been more urgent. And if you agree with us, we invite you to join us in this fight.